So welcome to our session webinar today. So I'm Damien Womfor, so I'm the founder of Catalyst, and I'm really pleased to have a dear friend with me again, and Ruth. And I'll introduce Ruth in a moment in terms of the research and what she's going to be sharing today. Just wanted to say that you're on listen only mode, so you can see and hear Ruth and I, but we can't see or hear from you. So we would like to use the chat panel, and I can sort of see some people putting some messages on there now. So please feel free to add reflections, questions as we're going through the session today. And I will pause at certain points and bring some of those questions into the dialogue I'm having with Ruth around coaching senior leader transitions. So in terms of other bits around setup, I'd always say close down any of our other applications. That just helps with transmission speed. The session will be recorded, so it will appear on our YouTube channel later this week, so you'll be able to access it again there. And I think the premise of these sessions is always about bite-sized CPD for coaches. So that's why they're 30 minutes. We find that time is about the right length of time, but always open to feedback. So please feel free to send any sort of comments through to us as well. So really pleased to have Ruth with us. So Ruth Simpson, so executive coach, team coach, consultant. And as some of the group have heard, Ruth, we've known each other for a long time now. So I'm really pleased you could make the space today for having this conversation with me.
You're welcome.
And I was really keen for the group to hear from Ruth and the research, her PhD research that she's currently completing around senior leader transitions. And so this sort of follows a previous webinar that we started last May. And again, that webinar is available on our YouTube channel. If you are really interested in this topic, it's worth going back to that. But we will be building on that today in terms of this conversation. So Ruth, anything you'd like to say at the start before we get going into the conversation?
Well, thanks very much for having me back, and thanks for joining the webinar. Really interested. Damien and I will have a dialogue, and really interested if you've got any specific questions to put those in the chat in terms of what you want out of it, or any specific questions, and then we'll try and keep an eye on that and try and answer that anything that comes up too. Shall I just give a bit of background to my research now?
Please.
Yeah. So as Damien mentioned, I am doing a part-time PhD at Oxford Brookes. I'm halfway through now, which is a bit of a relief. Hopefully I'm halfway through anyway. The purpose is exploring group coaching for the transition to a senior leadership position. And there's a couple of reasons for doing this. Firstly, if any of you have seen me speak before, my interest has always been how do we enable people to adapt and respond to change? So way back when I was corporate and then consulting, it's how can we help people get through this process, recognizing how difficult it can be. And then a lot of my work as a one-to-one coach, I was working with leaders who were making this transition to a senior leadership position, or perhaps who'd been in a senior leadership position for a while and there were still some things they were struggling with. So it was really of interest to me in terms of what was happening and going on there. And the reason for group coaching, as well as there's really very little information about little research about group coaching. To be honest, little research, it's not very well written about, never mind research. If you look in a lot of the textbooks, there may be chapters on one-to-one coaching, there may be chapters on team coaching, but there's very little on group coaching itself. And part of that because it's very difficult to define it. But people are doing all sorts of different things. And so what I'm trying to do is do some empirical research so we can get to understand what group coaching is and what it can do. And then it allows me to explore this transition at the same time. So I have conducted the first part of my research, and I interviewed leaders and coaches who had worked with leaders making this transition. So I did a couple of pairs, so a leader and the coach they worked with, and then individual coaches who'd worked with leaders in transition, and individual leaders who had made the transition and been coached through it. So the research is simply looking at coaching for the transition to it. It's not looking generally at the transition itself. And as we spoke in May more broadly about the theme, and today I'm just going to share the findings from that small study that I've just done.
Thanks, Ruth. And just before you move on, I just sent a question from Kat saying, how would you define group coaching? So, you know.
Great question. Yeah. I guess the two key things that are standing out when you look at the literature is it's a small group. We're probably talking about 6 to 8, something like that. Some people do talk about doing group coaching, 40 people on a webinar. And, you know, you can certainly raise awareness and responsibility at that level. What I'm talking about is that more smaller group in order to get to the depth. So in this situation, I'm talking about it like that. And the key difference is that the focus is on individual goals, as opposed to team, where you're focused on the team goals. Sometimes you may do some hybrid group and team. You may be working on a team goal with an element of individual development, but the key focus for group coaching for me is a small group, and the focus is on the achievement of individual goals. Is that, is there anything else you think, Damien, or do you think that covers that?
I think so. I think so. And it'll be a coach working with that small group of coaches, just looking at that subsequent question that's come through. So,
but it's a great question, and it's a key part of the PhD. Hopefully I'll be able to share that more specifically when I've done the action research.
So let's move into reflecting on the research that you've carried out so far, like you said, with the coaches and the senior leaders that have transitioned and been coached through transition. So, you know, what would you say are the experiences of the leaders, you know, that are going through the process of transition, just based on your research?
From what I've seen, it is, well, there's one thing, it's completely unique. Every individual leader will experience it differently. It seems to be this coming together of everything you've done up till then and this incredibly pressured and challenging role. The pressure comes both from that move to a strategic, away from the operational, much more strategic, away from the function, so bigger picture. And at the same time, you've got that pressure. You've got the increased accountability. You're higher up the organization, so more people can see you. So there's that combination of the role, what you bring with it from your past, and the pressure that really kind of comes together. So all sorts of different words that leaders have used. There is excitement, you know, there's possibility, there's a sense of achievement, and there's also that perhaps bizarrely guilt comes out. I mean, probably linked to, am I good enough? Was I good enough to get the role? But also that real fear of failure, that self-doubt, confusing, spinning, all of those kind of emotions are mixed up into it. So it's a real kind of, hits you. Having said that, of course, I was interviewing leaders who'd worked with coaches, and coaches did say often you won't see leaders who have sailed through the transition. And there are some. It was really interesting talking to Claire and some people who've worked in professional services, for example. And there are some people who make a senior leader transition and they thrive. It's almost like the rest of their career. They have now found the place they can be. So for some people, it is very exciting, and they can kind of get to grips with it well. Those tend, however, not to be the ones that are coached. Some people will just pick it up and fly with it. But what I'm talking about are those people for whom it has been a bit of a struggle, and they're probably more likely, it's certainly the majority, and they're probably more likely to be coached through it.
So just hearing you say that then, Ruth, can I just pick up on that in terms of the purpose of the coaching was because the person, the leader, was finding it difficult to transition, or was that just a sort of sense of they were having coaching and they were struggling with the transition at the same time. Do you see the difference compared
Yeah,
to the
yeah,
person
absolutely.
applying?
Absolutely. I think, and I think that's what makes it. This was a very small exploratory study. So we're not able to pick up things as to why people have come to coaching. I think it can really, really depend. And that word struggle, were they struggling with the transition, or was there something else and it all kind of came together? For example, people were starting the coaching. Somebody had started working with a coach before they'd taken up the position. Someone else had been in post 18 months before they started working with the coach. So it's almost, who knows what could bring about the coaching engagement. It's not necessarily the transition. And certainly in my experience, sometimes I've worked with very senior leaders, and some of the things that I would have expected them to have addressed earlier, they haven't, because they've kind of almost pushed on through it. So I don't think it's possible to say whether it's the appointment and that's when you get someone in, or they're going to struggle and that's when they get someone in. Who knows what it could be for.
And in terms of, and again, it's just comes from a place of curiosity about how the organisation were involved in the coaching process as well for these leaders that were transitioning.
Yeah, the organisation makes a huge difference, and I think that was really helpful from speaking to different coaches with a lot of experience. You realise what a huge impact the coaching, the culture of the organisation has on this. In each case, the leaders that I worked with, I think one of them had started working with a coach, and coaching wasn't part of that organization, so that was a very individual experience. But for others, the leaders, coaching was a way of being developed in the organization, so the rest of the organization, they had very supportive bosses, which made a big difference to the culture, to the support that the leader had. But the coaches did speak of other organizations where there's no support at all for the individual, and that's going to change the nature of the coaching, because if the leader is in an organization where there isn't much focus on learning and development, then and there's a lack of feedback and there isn't that kind of culture, then the coach's role tends to be a lot more about strengths identification and to perhaps fill that gap in terms of to allow the leader to learn to validate their own performance a bit better. Whereas if they're getting that from the rest of the organization, the coach may take on a different role. So yeah, the culture of the organization will to a large degree influence what the coaching focuses on and how it goes.
And there's just a question that come through from Karen. Is there any evidence that those who previously had coaching are the ones to thrive, or might likely to still rely on a coach's support?
No, I haven't seen any evidence to support that. Again, with all coaching research, it's so difficult to narrow down the effect of the coaching. But no, I haven't seen any evidence-based research that shows whether or not it's easier. That is simply a hypothesis of mine from experience.
So if that's what the leaders were sort of reporting around the process of transition, therefore, what are themes that have emerged so far that have been met in coaching? Actually, that'd be useful.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's very similar. I went back to the slides in the webinar that we did in May, and a lot of the things that you anticipate are there. I could just title this whole thing "Nothing New Here," which is good because it confirms a lot of what we already know in the field. I think what I managed to pick out was, for me, there's three things that really come together in this situation. The first is a question of competence. I mean, some people do step into the position and well, I'm here, it'll all be fine, and they perhaps underestimate the fact that what they have to do is very different to what they've done before. And there is this real, well, hang on, I thought I was quite good. As one of the coaches says, often this is the first time people have struggled at work because it is such a different role. So there is a real issue of confidence and hang on, can I actually do this? And that then leads to doubt in terms of self. I thought I was really quite good. I've been promoted, yet I don't know. So there's something about competence that then affects that self-doubt. And related to that is how you see yourself, because if you've always seen yourself as a high achiever, then it's quite difficult to manage that. Well, hang on, what does the world look like now? So there's competence, there's identity, and then the last thing related to this is how you relate to other people. And those three things kind of come together, and you don't know whether it's going to come in from competence or relating to other people. The leaders did mention how, you know, people look at them differently when they've got a senior position, and that can throw them off balance. So maybe that's what causes them to question who they are now. But that this point, these three things: it's competence, it's how you relate to others, and it's identity, or it's identity, competence, relating to others. Those three things are the really big things that have stood out. And then therefore the role coaching plays is, I've called it enabling a process of self-orientation, because it is for the leaders to kind of work out, whoa, what is going on here? What is going on here, both in terms of what I'm doing, but also who am I? Because they realize that as leader, particularly to do very well, it's about who you are now, as opposed to just what you do. And so they do need to start asking themselves that, and that then leads to an exploration of the past. How did I even get here? What are the drives? What's important to me? So there's some work around values in terms of where do I need to focus my efforts and energies? What do I think is important? And then there's some visualization about the future in terms of how do I want things to be? So it's that around all of those three areas, it's then this process of self-orientation in terms of, whoa, what does this all mean for me, and how do I want it to be moving forward?
And Kim's just reflected on, you know, the person that's being promoted vertically in the organization, you know, in terms of achieving that senior role, versus somebody that's perhaps moving externally. Any thought around these three aspects in terms of just what you've seen between the internal candidate and the external?
Yeah, I think they all throw up their own challenges. I think ultimately it still begs that question: who am I? You know, and what am I bringing to this role? It was interesting. A couple of the leaders had been promoted from within their team, so their original peer set became their reports, and equally their peers were now people that they had been senior to them, and that was quite disarming for them. And so that throws up its own challenges, because then you're having to shift relationships that you've already known. Whereas for someone coming into the organization, in some ways it's easier because you're coming in with a blank sheet of paper. So yes, they are different, but they just throw up different set of challenges. Clearly, if you're new to the organization, you've got a lot of work to do in terms of understanding the culture and the ways of doing things around here. But those are often well attended to in terms of onboarding. It's more what I'm seeing here around the coaching is that more personal. How am I and who am I in this role?
Yeah,
and really key.
Well, I can really hear that sort of sense of, you know, the identity shift that's taking place for the leader, and really, you know, having a space to explore that. So we've got this process around self-orientation as you're describing it. So what would you say this means for the coaching, to, you know, transition coaching, but also for coaches that may be transitioning and supporting leaders?
The coaches that are transitioning to support leaders, senior leaders, did you mean? Yeah. I think what it's saying to me is that this real ability for the coaches to not anticipate things. You know, I think certainly on, you know, you kind of think you've got a CV, you've got a conversation, you've done the pre-coaching conversation, and it's very easy for you to think what you're going to get. And I never cease to be surprised in that regard from clients, in terms of you've no idea what the issues are or where they're going to be. And I think initially it's really creating that for the coach to create the space to not think this is what you're going to see, this is what you're going to find out. Bridget Farron's in her book Transitions, I forget the full title, you know, she wrote some
Lost in
predictable
Transition.
Yeah. predictable surprises you may encounter. But I think that the key thing for me, for the coach, is to be able to really step back and see what the leader is bringing. All of the leaders spoke about how they really appreciated the space to just think and talk. Some people have never struggled before and they've never had these kind of conversations, and it's for the coaches to create that very space, not safe, non-judgmental space, to just speak and talk and just see what comes out. So I think it is really stepping back and let that happen, and then being able to respond as most appropriately. The roles as coach could be normalizer. Yeah, everybody. Do you think anyone else has been through this? You know, it's bringing into the knowledge of transitions, and yes, understanding how difficult it is. There could be some education in terms of leadership models, leadership responsibilities. There could be some mentoring, interesting mentoring in terms of whether coaches disagree as to whether or not they play a mentoring role or not. It depends how you're viewing that, but I think it's being able to address the gaps that are going to be there at the time, whether that's educator, coach, challenger, supporter, and then the last piece is to have that bank of inputs and exercises as required, in terms of, if it's a constellation exercise may work, an image, maybe it's drawing. And in my experience as well, obviously we'll go off what the client brings us in terms of their particular styles. But often I find, because leaders haven't really thought or worked this way before, sometimes you have to keep coming at it from different angles, and then suddenly it will open up. And I think it's not being put off by, God, that didn't work, I'm useless. It's like, okay, well, that hasn't worked, let's try another way in. And they're all useful in the end, but it's tremendously exciting when something just works. But I think it is that very much present, in being present with the client in this situation and seeing what is going to come up. Damien, you've done a lot of this. Does that sound?
Yeah, no, it does, because I think the challenge is often because you get sort of models like first 90 days, first 100 days that can be quite formulaic, and I think they're useful, but there's a sort of sense of, I suppose what I'm really resonating with as you talk about this is that the whole identity piece, you know, and that sort of time for real understanding who you are as a leader, and now who you need to be as well. I just saw a comment come up from one of the participants around endings, and just the importance of being able to end well in the previous role before moving into this new position. And again, just anything that emerged when you research around that sort of endings, new beginnings phase.
Yeah, I think I just noticed someone's written something in there about Bridges and his work as well, in terms of transitions. And there is definitely something in terms of what you bring from your old role, and that realization that role has come to an end, and it's about being in the role in a new new kind of form. I think the process of transition, there's a lot about expectations. And if you're bringing a lot from your previous role into those expectations, then it can really have a poor impact on it, because you get into your new role and suddenly you can't implement that new tech system that you assumed you were going to be able to. So yeah, I think closing and ending that last role will make it a lot easier then. You know, fundamentally, if you look at, I mean, you can go back to evolutionary biology, and the way organisms thrive is they keep what's important, they drop what no longer serves them, and they develop the new stuff that they need. And I've seen that in these interviews. Hopefully I wasn't just looking for it, but it has become very clear that the role what coaching does is help leaders identify what their strengths are. So not related to the role, but what are your strengths as an individual? What do you need to drop? And there was a lot of this detail, this need for detail, and the old relationships that people had that they were still hanging on to that weren't serving them well. So yeah, dropping those, and then developing new skills, behaviors, and ways of being to enable them to work with stakeholders in a different way. And so I think that being able to have the space to work out what falls into those three buckets, and then that messy, horrible phase of trying it. And that's another thing in terms of coaching. The last thing is really to embed the learning. Whilst you need to create the space, at the same time, it's right, okay, how can you use this learning? And all coaches spoke about going off practicing in between sessions so that people can really learn from it and develop some sustainable practices for moving forward. So it's not just a lot of time talking. The space is really important to start with, but then it's moving it on to what we're actually going to do about it.
Yeah, not holding the assumption that the senior leader knows what to do with it. So bringing that challenge to really create that sort of specific action between sessions. So Ruth, if there was one key piece of advice you would give coaches that are working with leaders in transition, what would that be? Because again, I'm just thinking about the timing here now and starting to pull things to a close. But what's
they're great.
Advice?
It's a lovely question. It's a great question. And I think from what I've seen at the moment, it is to create that safe space and to be fully present with what the client is going to need. I think it really, that self as coach is really more important perhaps than in some other roles in terms of creating that for the leader to see what comes up, you know, and then work with what the leader brings. As opposed to anything else. I think that would be I had never appreciated quite how valuable that space just to talk about whatever it is, business, not business, you know, inside work, outside work. Creating that space is just so valuable to start off with and then moving it through to learning.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Just anything else you want to say before we start to pull things to a close?
Well, the only thing to say is the next stage of my research is action research. I'm going to be working with groups of leaders making the transition to a senior leadership position. When I say I'm going to be, I've no idea who that's going to be with at the moment. Obviously, organizations have got a lot of other things on. But if any of you know of any organizations that may be interested in this, I'd like to do 2 or 3 cycles. It'd be 4 or 5 workshops, meeting sessions. Not quite sure what to call them yet, but it'll be small groups of senior leaders going through the transition. So with any luck, in a year to 18 months, I'll be back to share with you the findings from that phase of the research.
Thank you. And if anybody's interested, just feel free to drop me an email and I'll pass your details on to Ruth.
Great.
I'd perhaps put your email address on the chat panel, Ruth.
Yeah, good idea.
So whilst Ruth is doing that, just to say that our next webinar is going to be on the 19th of April at 1 o'clock UK time. That's going to be on the drama triangle within the coaching relationship. So really hope that you can join that session. And also just to remind you, we've got our virtual CPD event happening on the 16th of July, which is all around the dynamics of team coaching. So information's on our website. I really hope that you'll be able to participate in that as well. So thanks, Ruth. I really appreciate you making the time. And thanks to everyone for joining and look forward to seeing you again soon. So go well and see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.